Is the guard correct? Say, oh say, is the guard correct? It was not. In one flash he saw it. In spite of his diagrams and descriptions, they had got the shoulder knots all wrong. The 18th century had never known that sort of thing. He looked at them, for the first moment almost with the pure satisfaction of the specialist. He almost, somewhere in him, joined in that insane jangle. No, 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 the guard is wrong. Oh, wrong. Say, I say. He looked, and he swung as if on his rope, as if at a point of decision, to go on or to climb up. He walked slowly along the line, round the back, negligent of remarks and questions, outwardly gazing, inwardly swinging. After that first glance, he saw nothing else clearly. Say yes or no. The shoulder knots could be altered easily enough, all 12, in an hour or so's work. Or pass them, take us as we are, say yes. They could be defended then, and there, with half a dozen reasons. They were no more of a jumble than Stanhope's verse. But he was something of a purist. He did not like them. His housekeeper, for that matter, could alter them that evening under his direction and save the costume makers any further trouble. Is the Grand Duke's guard, correct? A voice penetrated him. Hugh was saying, one must have one's subordinates exact, mustn't one? There was the slightest stress on subordinates, or was there? Wentworth looked askance at him. He was strolling superb by his side. Pauline said, we could alter some things, of course. His silence had made her anxious. He stood away and surveyed the backs of the guard. He could, if he chose, satisfy and complete everything. He could have the coats left at his house after the rehearsal. He could do what the honor of his scholarship commanded. He could have them returned. It meant only his being busy with them that one evening, and concerning himself with something different from his closed garden. He smelt the garden. Mrs. Perry's voice said, is the guard correct? He said, yes. It was over. He could go.
I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self.
Welcome to the Inklings Variety Hour, where fans and scholars of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and others discuss their works and lives. I'm Chris Pipkin, Associate Professor of Literature at Emmanuel College in Georgia and tireful corrector of electric papers. And joining me today, we have Sorina Higgins. Sorina recently received her Ph.D. from Baylor University, where she studied magic and modernist theater. And she's a faculty member at Signum University, where she also coordinates the Writers Forge coaching service. She's the editor of the book The Inklings and King Arthur, and is currently co-editing a volume with Brenton Dickinson called Gardeners of the Galaxies, How Imaginary Worlds Teach Us to Care for This One. How are you doing, Sorina?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks so much for joining us again to talk Charles Williams.
It's a great pleasure.
It is. And we also have Sophie Burkhardt. Sophie is a fellow podcaster and an Inklings fan. Check out her podcast at Beneath the Willow Tree for her musings on life, philosophy, and literature. How are you doing, Sophie?
I am great. Happy to be here.
Good, good, good. When C.S. Lewis read Charles Williams' Descent into Hell, he wrote to congratulate him. He called it a thundering good book and real purgation to read, as well as much the best book you've given us yet. In the first place, I find the form of evil that you're dealing with much more real than the evil with a big E that appears in the other books. Lewis also said that while in sheer writing Williams had gone up a whole class, he disliked what he called Williams' Gertrude Steinisms, such as Eves, guard, card, etc., as well as the conversations between Stanhope and Pauline. And Descent into Hell, I agree, is among the best of Charles Williams' novels, if not the best. They're so-called spiritual thrillers in which everyday decisions made by modern people hold profound moral and metaphysical meaning. The novel takes place in the fictional town of Battle Hill, where events as seemingly mundane as the rehearsal of a play or an old historian's jealousy are as supernatural and significant as the posthumous journey of a suicide or a girl's flight from her own image when she meets herself walking down the street. Battle Hill contains in itself both heaven, the true city, and hell, for these more than afterlife destinations are tendencies in the heart of every person that may be fostered or destroyed. We have all, it turns out, descended to hell. But is it possible to descend there in order to rescue others from it? As the book goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that the only true path out of hell lies through it, when we carry each other's burdens. For readers who are joining us for the first time without having listened to the earlier episodes, what should they know going into this episode?
This is the most overwhelming of questions. But I made myself notes this time, so hopefully it'll be somewhat clear. So the book starts with all these people coming together to put on a play written by the great Peter Stanhope. And then from there, we have the continuation of work on the play, and that's just like one consistent theme or line that's going on throughout the story. But we also have several different stories happening at once that go on their own separate paths and then kind of come together at various parts. There is the story of the suicide. This is a man who died years before, and we sort of see his death, and then later on we see him in this kind of in-between place where he's given a glimpse of hell, but he's given a chance to be redeemed, and he's sort of saved by the love of Margaret Anstruther, who is this wise old grandmother who can see extraordinary visions that few of us can make any sense out of. So he's sort of saved by her, and then also a little bit, Pauline Anstruther comes into that storyline a little bit. Pauline is probably, I guess, the main character of the book. We spend the most time with her, seems fair to say. She has a doppelganger that she sees at various times, and she is terrified of it, terrified of meeting it up close and personal. But then we get to a point where the great Peter Stanhope offers to carry the burden of her fear for her. And so we get the notion of substitutionary exchange. So we've already had that happen, and her fear leaves her, and she's able to sort of slowly step into a role of carrying other people's burdens, but we haven't gotten to the climax of that yet. On the opposite side of her, so she's ascending up into heaven, descending down into hell is Wentworth. And this is my personal favorite storyline, which is kind of sad because it's so dark. But he has these dreams where he's slowly going down a rope, and he continues to isolate himself from the community because as a historian, he's jealous of another historian, Aston Moffat, who actually cares about what he's doing. And then he also has feelings for this younger woman, Adela Hunt, but she refuses him for the young Hugh Prescott. She doesn't up front refuse him, but she picks the other guy. And so he isolates himself more and more, creates this phantasm, which she has a reality that is more than just sheer imagination. He keeps isolating himself more and more and more in her presence until we get up to this point where he is willing to just completely lie about something that would have been easy for him to tell the truth about. And I think that pretty much encapsulates where we're at this point.
Well done. Yeah, great.
Really good, weaving all the different threads together.
Into a big rope, I would say. Sorina, what kind of a spiritual world is this as we kind of head into the middle of chapter 8? What do we need to know about the kind of moral and spiritual landscape?
It's a world in which heaven and hell touch right upon our everyday reality. So unlike C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien's worlds, which are otherworldly, we kind of walk out a door or through a portal into this other world. Instead, this is an ordinary suburb of London where people are doing ordinary things, but the supernatural is impinging upon it. And therefore, we have these catalysts of damnation or salvation that can be really, really tiny. They can be a material object, or they can be a little decision that somebody makes, and we'll come to the most crucial of those tiny objects and tiny decisions in this chapter. But often in Williams' novels, there'll be a physical object and people's responses to it will show which direction they're heading for, right? Like the Holy Grail or a magical stone or something like that. We don't have particular object in here, but we do have all these little ways that people respond to a play, a work of poetry, something they hear about their ancestors or with their neighbors, right? That those reveal these monstrously huge realities. In your excellent summary, Sophie, you talked about the substitution and exchange. So this is a moral universe in which an individual's spiritual decisions have eternal and infinite consequences, right? So in which individual and seemingly ordinary people can effect real change on a cosmic level. So I think those are some elements of the moral spiritual world. What do you think? Does that seem accurate?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very well put. Yeah, and especially I like that you touched on the small decisions that people make, right? It's not about like, you heard a sermon in a church and you came forward, or, what we might think of in the evangelical world as like, this is the big decision that caused me to, be turned from hell to heaven or whatever. No, in Williams, every moment is infused with grace and you can choose against that grace or for that grace. So it's like at every second there's an altar call, which is incredibly beautiful, and also like it's a little bit of pressure to live with, to be honest.
Right, because the steps to hell also are not like murders and betrayals of one's country and denial of one's friends. No, they're tiny little handholds down that rope towards hell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's so crucial that Wentworth doesn't feel fear, right? The things that lead us to heaven make us afraid, but the things that lead us down to hell do not. They're things that we choose because they bring us comfort. Last time we got about halfway through chapter 8 and didn't quite finish it, and we started today by reading the passage with the uniforms, and I want to talk about that. But what's been going on in this chapter 8 dress rehearsal? Is there anything more specific we need to say that we've seen so far?
There's further development of Wentworth's relationship with the real and the false Adela, and the fact that he is now preferring this succubus that his own imagination has given birth to, so that he can't even be bothered with the real Adela anymore.
Yeah, for a while he has to carry her over the threshold, kind of like some other vampire creature of the night sort of thing, right? Where you have to take them through. And like as he's doing it, he realizes like, well, the real Adela would be heavier than this, right? And his mind just like puts that away, and it's like, no, this is the real thing.
Also a terrible parody of the bridegroom carrying the bride over the threshold,
yes.
Right? And so he's rejected that possibility of having a real woman who might be heavy to carry and sometimes difficult to live with, and instead he prefers himself, really.
Yeah.
An emanation of himself.
Increasingly, he doesn't go out in public. And we have, Sophie, I forget how much we touched on this last time. We hear about succubi and incubi and things like that there are creatures that are not quite human, that give people what they think they want. Gradually, Wentworth starts to feel that he wants to hurt or kill Adela because she seems to be threatening this fake reality that he's created for himself with the false Adela. But then when he meets her in dress rehearsal, he lets go of that idea, because this Adela is nothing like his actual beloved, right? And so we see how far removed this fantasy is that he's had from the woman that he, started out thinking he liked or was in love with or whatever else. Wentworth has a series of very awkward interactions with people during the dress rehearsal. It just does not seem quite mentally all there, because he really resents being out in public. He just wants to go back. He wants to retreat back into his safe little room with his fantasy. And then comes the big moment. He is asked, in his professional opinion as a historian, did they get the shoulder knots on the guard? Did they get it right? And he knows that they got it completely wrong, and he should care about this sort of thing as a historian, but he does not. He's decided to lie. Yes, it is correct, so that they leave him alone and stop bothering him so he could go home. That is the moment at which his damnation is sort of complete, because the very thing that he's supposed to care about, he's stopped caring about it. And so he's lost in some ways his function in relation to the city. Thoughts on that? Questions? Concerns?
I think this was the first passage in all of Williams that made me realize what he's doing with these tiny little steps, how something so incredibly small as the way it's probably a piece of braiding, right? A piece of rope or something that makes a pattern on the shoulder of these military uniforms. It's just twisted incorrectly. It's such a tiny detail. It really doesn't matter, right? So it's not the piece of fabric that's the problem. And it's not even necessarily the fact that he doesn't correct it that's a problem. It's the fact that it's a rejection of community and it's a rejection of integrity. Because by his rejecting it, he's causing people who trusted him to do something wrong when they were trusting him to set them right. You know, they cared about historical accuracy, and yet he can't be bothered because he just wants to go home and have an evening with this false Adela. He doesn't want to spend any time with other humans. And then also it's throwing away all the integrity of his field, of academia, of history, of facts. And facts were really important to Charles Williams. He had this idea that one of the big mental and spiritual wrongs that we can commit is just rejecting facts. And he almost went as far as Blake, that everything that is holy, right? That just because something exists, it's obviously part of the will of God. And so we have to submit to the reality of facts, however awkward they might be or uncomfortable for us.
Yeah, there's a great passage earlier on where Margaret Anstruther is like vaguely bothered by Lily Samil, and she's sort of like, well, the Lord had allowed her to exist, and so she must have some positive role to play before this is all said and done. I like that. It's very Augustinian, right? It's very kind of all that exists only becomes evil through kind of being knotted. That existence itself, because God created it, is holy.
There's a negation, there's a rejection.
What's weird to me about this is that I can understand a world, and I'd be terrified to live in such a world, and perhaps I do live in such a world, where tiny, tiny decisions move us inexorably toward holiness or toward damnation. Why wouldn't committing suicide be one of those decisions? If all the little decisions really matter, you would think putting a rope around your neck and hanging yourself, as the suicide does, who is given another chance in the hereafter, you'd think that would be kind of ultimate rejection of community, like much more so than like not correcting shoulder knots. Interestingly, both have to do with rope, which is weird.
The man who commits suicide, he explicitly rejects community. He's purposefully doing it to get away from his boss and to get away from his wife, whom he very troublingly just describes as a nagging voice in an upper room over and over and over. And he's afraid that it hasn't succeeded and he's still alive, and that the voice will come after him. So I agree with you, Chris. I think it's sort of problematic that man explicitly rejected community and chose death over community. So yeah, it's perplexing.
I don't know, Sophie, do you have a corrective to offer?
No, not necessarily. But I was thinking when I was rereading this earlier today, there's these couple of lines on page 142 where it says, like the dead man on his flight down the hill, he declined communion. But he to whom more room and beauty and life had been given, chances of clarity and devotion, was not now made frightening to himself. He had not known fear, nor did he find fear, nor was fear the instrument of salvation. So I feel like it has something to do with the circumstances, as if Wentworth had more opportunity to have clarity about what the world is really like. He had more chances to love. I mean, I don't know if these are good enough reasons in the end, but it seems like because of the life he had, he doesn't need a second chance after death, whereas the other man for some reason did. And I don't know, I think it has something to do with the notion of fear, like the other man just needs a little fear in him, and then he's able to not choose hell, whereas nothing is going to stop Wentworth from doing it. So I don't know, that was like the only clarifying passage that I thought has something to do with why this is so much more important than suicide.
That's really good. Yeah. This might be a side note, and then I'll bring it back more directly, but I think there is a little bit of a political undertone going on here. Williams is known for being the furthest, quote unquote, left of the Inklings. He was the most concerned about poverty and social class and things that now we would probably call social justice, is the most concerned about those things. And there are several passages that talk about the man being driven to suicide by his circumstances and by the way he was treated. He was dehumanized over and over and over. And he could only get the hardest of manual labor, and then was even fired from those jobs and was always cold and hungry and wet and miserable. I think there's a certain sense that he was driven to suicide by the systemic injustice of the economic situation in which he found himself. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's very likely what Williams was getting at. And Sophie, I think that's a great passage to cite. I was trying to remember where that was when I was asking that question. I definitely see that. I don't know that I find it satisfying, but yeah, it's.
Can I add one other and see if you like this a bit more? I taught this book once to a bunch of honors students, and we had a very long, detailed, and somewhat macabre conversation about, does he actually commit suicide? Because at the very last minute, he changes his mind and he tries to stop, but he trips and he gets tangled in the rope and gravity takes hold and he swings out off the building and ends up hanging anyway. And we went very carefully word by word, but we were still not 100% sure in the end, because it goes back and forth with his intention. Yeah. But if he changed his mind at the last minute and died repenting of his desire to commit suicide, I wonder if that might possibly tie into this second chance. And I think I'm not postulating a general theology of suicide on Williams' part here,
right.
In this particular case.
I think that's a great point. And there is definitely some fumbling going on in that second chapter, right? Yeah, I want to talk. I think we'll talk more about him in chapter 9, especially as he relates to being kind of like one of the masses of poor, and his lack of individuation specifically kind of bothers me. I have a problem with the idea that because someone doesn't have education or money, they don't have moral agency, because my experience with very poor people has been they have a whole lot of moral agency, like more so than a lot of very educated people in some cases.
That's a really important point. But Wentworth was also offered chance after chance after chance after chance, and he has been climbing down this rope.
Yeah, definitely. So the other thing about this I wanted to bring up is Stanhope, because Stanhope keeps seeing people acting out it's his play. It's his whole play that he's written, and he keeps just kind of chuckling at people who are reading his poetry in a way that is not correct. And you'd think that if poetry is so gosh danged important, that might be as damning a thing not to correct as the shoulder knots on the guard. I was wondering if y'all can help me parse this out as to why this is wrong in Wentworth's case not to use his sort of specialization to help them do this right, but it's actually right and correct for Stanhope to kind of step back and let them perform the play in a way that apparently is not great.
Because it's his. I think that's a really big difference. It's Stanhope's play. So I think his correcting them would seem arrogant. It would seem that he was putting himself above them, whereas Wentworth was supposed to have a scholar's objective relationship with this thing outside of himself. And also, they asked Wentworth to correct them. They came to him and said, let's consult with you. Will you correct this? Stanhope has graciously submitted himself and his art to Mrs. Perry's direction. And on cases when she comes and asks him, he gives his opinion, which they usually then promptly ignore. But he does give it when he's asked. But I think it's more like if you're trying to correct the way someone was treating yourself, or if you were trying the way someone was saying something about your personal appearance or something, because the play is so much a part of himself. I think it's an act of humility and sacrifice that he's sitting back and letting them do this on their own.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, that's very clarifying. Thank you.
Thinking too that it has to do with your relation to the community, which I mean is basically what you're saying. Like if Stanhope constantly told them they were doing it wrong, that would destroy community. Whereas the way he's doing it is encouraging community, and Wentworth is the opposite. And then also even on page 144, when it says the shoulder knots could be defended then and there with half a dozen reasons, they are no more of a jumble than Stanhope's verses. But he was something of a purist. He did not like them. I think part of it has to be I don't think Stanhope is a purist in the way that Wentworth is a purist. Like I think it has to do with the fact of he specifically does not like the shoulder knots, and it's not even that he doesn't care. Like he recognizes that he doesn't like them, and then he chooses not to say anything about it. And it doesn't seem to bother Stanhope personally too much that his play isn't acted out to perfection. So it seems like it has to do with more of those, the individual way in which they react to what's going on, and then the way that the community is involved.
Really good. And doesn't it also come from Stanhope's knowledge of the people? He knows that they cannot speak the poetry any better than they are, because he has this belief that poetry is reality. And so you can only speak it from your whole life's experience, and only if you have loved in certain ways and experienced exchange in certain ways and lived through grief and so forth. So he couldn't correct them because they are not yet the people who could speak his verse correctly.
That is great. Well, I feel like that question has been answered for me for sure. So thank you both so much. And I think it's definitely key, both that it would bother the real Wentworth if he wasn't increasingly becoming a phantom of himself, right? It would bother him a lot more, and also the fact that they are asking Wentworth to play his role as a historian. So well said. The other major thing that happens in this chapter is that Pauline is having a pretty grand time. She's enjoying the dress rehearsal, and then she realizes that the woodcutter in the play is building a fire at about the same place on Stanhope's property that her ancestor John Strother was born. This leads her to this sort of morose meditation on death and fear and the horrible things that people do to each other. And that's when she mentions to Stanhope, "It all seems going very well," she said with a coldness in her voice that rose from the creeping hollow of the darkness. "You think so? Did you know that an ancestor of mine was burnt alive, just here?" He turned to walk by her. "I did," he said. "I'd read it, of course. After all, it's my house, and your grandmother spoke of it." She said, "Well?" And then repentantly, "I'm sorry, but we're all so happy. The play, the fire, our fire, it's all so wonderful. And yet we can do that. How can we be happy unless we forget? And how can we forget? How can we dare forget?" He said, "Forget nothing. Unless everything's justifiable, nothing is. But don't you forget perhaps something else?" She looked at him with question. He went on, "Mightn't his burden be carried too?" She stopped. She said, staring, "But he's dead!" There's the suggestion that Stanhope makes that Pauline might be called to carry her ancestor's burden for him, which is, to me, fun and super trippy.
Pretty astonishing.
Yeah, and so she's wrestling with this into the end of this chapter and the beginning of the next. Any other things that you all would want to make sure, talk about in chapter 8?
Williams wrote a play called Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury, which was his Canterbury Festival play. And the most famous Canterbury Festival play is T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. And they're both about these martyrs named Thomas. And T.S. Eliot's play was about a martyr who actually was killed there in Canterbury, right? Like famously, Thomas Becket was murdered in the sanctuary, right by the altar, killed right in his church. Well, when Eliot's play was first performed, it was not performed on the exact spot. It was in the chapter house, which is right next door. Later, it was revived and it was played on the exact spot so that the actor playing Thomas Becket would act the death in almost the same spot. Now, Williams' play is a little bit different because Thomas Cranmer, though he was of Canterbury, he was killed in Oxford, if I'm getting that correctly, but he was burnt at the stake. So we have these really interesting resonances here about a martyr whom Williams had in his mind. And he was thinking about an actual historical martyr who was burnt at the stake. And he himself had written a play about that martyr performed on the site of another important historical ecclesiastical martyrdom. So I think that some of these ideas were really vivid in Williams' mind. He wrote another one of his plays under the pseudonym Peter Stanhope, and the actors didn't actually know his real name, and he went to the rehearsals under the name Peter Stanhope, but like they called him that when he was there. So I just think it's really fun to have this like triangulation of real things in Williams' life that kind of converge behind this chapter, I think.
Yeah. Did you say, I think before you said that was Judgment at Chelmsford? Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
It was Judgment at Chelmsford, yeah.
Yeah, that's super cool. I love the intersection, too, of sort of Fox's Book of Martyrs and The Tempest, right? Like, there's this weird 16th century and 17th century thing going on with this, where you have these, as they're performing something that's kind of like the Tempest, she's remembering something, that people who had watched the original Tempest would have remembered, although I don't know that the Tempest would have made them think of it.
And that all, I think, comes around the idea of Stanhope as a new Shakespeare, right? As a Shakespeare for our century.
Yep. It's interesting to me that Pauline, who's the major character of the book, is, it seems like anyway, a minor character in the play, while Adela, who very much feels very important. She's an important character in the book, but not as important as Pauline, right? Plays the main character in the play. So it's this fun sort of reversal of importance in terms of the characters and in terms of these plots.
Maybe another iteration of that theme, that it's the ordinary who do extraordinary things, and it's these small moments and small characters who carry cosmic significance.
Okay, so we've got Chapter 9, The Tryst of the Worlds, which is the crisis point and fulfillment of so much that has happened. We pick up with the ghost, and the ghost is wandering, but now the ghost is wandering in the correct direction. Or I should say the dead man. He never calls him the ghost, he calls him the dead man. But the dead man, the suicide, is wandering now back toward the ladder that he used to hang himself on after being spoken to kindly by the dying Margaret Anstruther, Pauline's grandmother. He's going back toward what Williams calls the city. Williams says he had the city in mind, he had his wife in mind, which is this sort of, it's a reversal of that which caused him to kill himself in the first place, right? These things that had been things that drove him to like almost damn himself, right, through suicide, are now the means of his salvation, because they are real, and they have to do with grappling with the reality of other people. Right, and even when they're inconvenient, he's turned back and he's making his way towards the city, and he sees the figure of a girl, and then we break off from his perspective, and we pick up with Pauline's perspective. But yeah, what are your thoughts about this first part of this chapter with the dead man?
Feels very like T.S. Eliot poem to me. It feels like the hollow men crowding together, like straw, like the sounds of rats in a cellar. This beginning feels very modern to me, like faceless crowds of workers.
Yeah, the dead man is interesting to me, partly because he's kind of the everyman, poor dead man. He seems to make most of his decisions almost kind of in response to stimuli. Like, oh, this is not nice, I'm going to go away from this, and I'm going to go towards this. And he seems to do this both when he's alive and also, after life. There's a kind of dullness to him, although increasingly he's becoming sort of sharp, right? And becoming, up until the point where later in this chapter he speaks with Pauline, and and seems like a fully realized individual. But up until that point, he seems very much a shade. And he reminds me both the kind of gibbering shades in Homer, right, who seem to be less than they were when they were alive. And he also seems close to sort of what Lewis describes when he talks about most people, increasingly most people, becoming sort of candidates from limbo because they never make real choices. When he sort of talks about them, and Screwtape proposes a toast and the problem with, using the word democracy in a certain way. Do you all think this sort of lack of distinctness that we've seen with the dead man up until now, is it more because he's dead, or is it more because he's lower class? Why is he the only one without a name? Why is he the only one that doesn't seem to make choices?
I read it more in the C.S. Lewis sense, that he didn't have a distinct personality because he had never really made sharp choices, that he hadn't become a full person. I think of it in terms of till we have faces. How can the gods meet us face to face until we have faces? That he sort of hasn't really faced up to his sufferings or the consequence of his choices until after this one big decision that he made. So I didn't read it as just because he's dead or as a social class commentary in this case.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and I think I agree.
He wasn't spiritually a very vivid person, right?
Right.
Because he hadn't really grasped the significance of his own decisions and of his own place in the universe.
Yeah, it's interesting that Wentworth is becoming increasingly like this as well, right? He seems to be losing himself, even as he's choosing himself to commit a Gertrude Steinism, or what Lewis calls Gertrude Steinisms. So the scene shifts, and we have Pauline and Margaret Anstruther. Anstruther is coming very close to death. After talking with Pauline a bit about, sure, you can carry the burdens of people who are your ancestors, right? Or says it in a very roundabout way. She says, "Would you be so very charming as to go out and see if anyone wants you?" Mrs. Anstruther said quite distinctly. "Up by Mr. Wentworth's." "She's wandering," the nurse whispered. Pauline, used to Mrs. Anstruther's extremely unwandering habits, hesitated to agree, but it was certainly rather odd. She said with a tenderness a little fractured by doubt, "Wants me, darling? Now?" "Of course now," her grandmother answered. "That's the point. I think perhaps he ought to get back to the city." She looked around with a little sigh. "Will you?" And so in response to her promise to go up to Wentworth's, and despite the fact that the grandmother's nurse basically, says, well, don't pay too much attention because her mind's kind of going, she keeps this promise and she goes, or she prepares to go. And this is really the last interaction we see between the two of them. So there really is a real risk involved in her doing her grandmother's bidding, that she might be out when her grandmother dies, right? It's interesting, and it brings up this motif of obedience, right? That we've seen several times already, that she's obeying her grandmother's possibly dying wish, which is interesting. I was kind of like, okay, their conversation is weird and highly elusive. "Peter Stanhope," Margaret said, "must have been frightened many times." "Oh, poetry," Pauline exclaimed bitterly. "That's different. You know it is, grandmother." "In seeing?" Margaret asked. "And as for being, you must find out for yourself. He can carry your parcels, but not you." "Couldn't he?" Pauline said. "Not that I want him to." Talking about, their ancestors. So I was like, this is sort of this mystical dying woman, possibly tinged with senility, which perhaps is like real spiritual vision or something like that. And then she decides randomly to call Stanhope up when she's heading towards the door, and they have a very elusive, meandering, sort of odd conversation.
In between the two, though, she has this vision, if it is a vision. She has this one page when apparently the house is burning around her because she's sort of thrust into her martyred ancestor's consciousness, I guess, for a quick moment, in between leaving her grandmother's bed and going out to search for the man who died, right?
Yeah. She caught up a hat and flung herself at the door, her blood burning within her as the house burned around. The air was fiery to her sense. She breathed a mingled life, as if the flames of poetry and martyrdom rose together in the air within the air, and touched the outer atmosphere with their interior force. She ran down the stairs, but already her excitement, being more excitement than strength, flagged and was pain. Action was not yet so united with reaction as to become passion. The doubt she must have of what was to come took its old habitual form. Her past pretended to rule her, a de facto sovereign, and her past was fear. She gets worried that maybe she's worried, it sounds like, and she calls Stanhope, and then she realizes that she doesn't need to call Stanhope.
That makes sense. So is she suddenly worried for a minute that the exchange isn't working? That her fear of her doppelganger is coming back? Is that what happens?
I think it's really, it just gets more and more opaque.
More accepting, because remember he had said, call me up anytime, even in the middle of the night. So maybe it's her accepting the necessity of relying on others.
Yeah.
Maybe she's just sinking into that, because before, she said, what about my dignity? Wasn't it my dignity? And he said, oh, dignity. Well, if we are of that sort, he made fun of her. So maybe she's just purposefully not standing on her own dignity.
Yeah.
Saying, I need somebody. I'm gonna make that gesture.
Yeah, I think both of those things are probably true.
Yeah, she's worried. It could only be that her ghostly image lay now in wait for her to emerge into its desolate kingdom. She grit her teeth. So she's about to re-shoulder her own burden, right? Yeah. The thing must be done. She's thinking, I'm going to have to go out in the street by myself in the middle of the night, which I've never done. I don't think she's ever done that before because of her fear of her doppelganger. And I think she's just about to re-shoulder her own burden, and then seeing the telephone remembers, oh, I don't have to carry this burden because he's carrying it. So I wonder if that's why she brings him up.
Yeah.
Just think about the bottom of page 161 of this notion of has more excitement than strength. And then that flags of it seems like she's caught up at first in this excitement of recognizing the substitution that Stanhope has done for her, and she can substitute for the martyr. But it's more excitement than a actually lasting, enduring strength. And that's action was not yet so united with reaction as to become passion. So it hasn't become such a deep part of her yet to be able to keep her strong through reacting to, I don't know, external stimuli of crazy things going on that she's not expecting. I don't know if this makes sense, but I'm thinking through this in my mind. It's understanding the doctrine of substitution is not so ingrained in her that it can stand strong against everything else that's going on. And so because she doubts that for a second, then the de facto of fear kind of pops in and fills up the empty space until she's able to kind of recover herself, recognize that Stanhope substituted for her. She doesn't need to be afraid anymore, and then she can go and substitute for somebody else. At least that's what I'm thinking those words are saying.
Yeah, you're right, because her mental habit through all of her past life has been be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. Yeah, so when the adrenaline of that rush of running down the stairs through the vision of fire and, I'm going to save my ancestor, when that adrenaline ebbs for a second, I think you're right. That old mental habit of fear comes back. So maybe that's why she does that physical action of picking up the phone and calling to try to establish this new habit in sanctity to counteract the old habit of fear.
Ooh, that's great. Yeah, and decides I oughtn't to disturb him, because that's again giving into fear of the other, right? To fear of inconveniencing someone else, right? And instead says I ought to disturb him, right? Because that requires humility. She said again, grave, "Are you awake enough to hear me?" "Complete with attention," he answered. "Whatever it is, how very, very right of you. That's abstract, not personal. Concede the occasion." Which increasingly I can't make head or tails of what he says to her. But
and that reportedly is exactly the way Charles Williams spoke to his friends.
Oh boy, I don't doubt it. So she ends up saying, "I thought I wanted to ring you up, but when I did, I didn't. Forgive me." He says, "If it gives you any pleasure, but you might have needed forgiveness, in fact, if you hadn't. God's not mine. Pardon, Periel, like love, is only ours for fun. Essentially, we don't and can't. But you want to go, ... You'll remember?"
It's a very difficult writing style, but it does work. If you really stop and unpack it, it really does work. But man, it's quite the compressed syntax here.
Yeah. I think part of what's going on possibly is if Stanhope is Charles Williams' poetic alter ego, then he's going to speak the way that Charles Williams writes poetry, which is sometimes difficult to follow. But maybe that's unfair.
I believe it's also meant to be difficult if you haven't been 100% tracking, because it's supposed to imply this intimacy between them and this 100% connection between their minds on the spiritual plane, so that they barely have to say anything and they read each other's minds. And the same thing with Pauline and her grandmother, right? They're the only three people in this book who have this mystical experience of exchange. So, just like somebody you've lived with for decades, a spouse or a sibling, you barely have to say anything and you finish each other's sentences and these oodles of implications behind a phrase. So I think that's going on here as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so she goes up to Wentworth's house, obeying her grandmother, and she encounters the dead man. She doesn't realize that it's the dead man. He just looks like a workman who's down on his luck, right? And you have this moment 3 times, I think, where he salutes her. To me, that's really meaningful just because I know Williams was a big Dante fan, and the sort of defining moments of Dante's life, what set him on the path toward God, was being saluted in the street or not saluted in the street by Beatrice. But yeah, there's this exchange of words, right, between Pauline and the dead man, and they talk with each other. And he's asking the way to London, and she tells him the way to London, offers him a place to stay, and he says, "No, I need to be going." And she says, "Go in peace." Yeah, really kind of significant moment. It completes what seemed to happen with her grandmother and the dead man when her grandmother said, "My dear, how tired you are." Pauline is actually offering the dead man a place to rest. He says, "No, I need to be going. I need to keep going." What are you all's thoughts on this? Why do you think he needs to go to London? And why do you think go in peace is the thing that causes what happens next?
Oh, why London? Because it's the city, and the city is the geographical heart of Williams's theology. He was not a country boy like the other Inklings. He wasn't one who would go on hikes across the countryside for days on end. He was a man of the city, and the city to him was the earthly expression of heaven, of the kingdom of God, of God working things out in an orderly fashion on earth. And yeah, Dante is a beautiful place to go for that, for the image of the city, or Augustine, of course, city of God. So by going back to London, he's entering the kingdom of God.
Yeah, again, and I mentioned this, I think, in the last podcast, but it reminds me of going to see a monastery in Romania, and the priest kind of like pointing out all this iconography, and heaven had just like all these overlapping saints in it, right? And he said, "I always tell people in my church, if you think it's too small here, just wait till you get to heaven, because it's really crowded in heaven." Yeah, Williams always reminds me of that when I read him. This idea of you need to run towards people, and you need to be sanctified by even the parts of them that are difficult, that takes place in a city, which is, if nothing else, a big collection of people.
He also saw it as this extremely orderly, complex system, right? It's a network, a mesh, or a web of glory in which everything is working together in extremely complex ways, but it's all harmonized in a way that you can't see when you're just one little part of it. Something that we ought to remember when we're paying for parking in New York or driving through Dallas to the airport.
Yeah. It's hard not to think of The Man Who Was Thursday and the one poet thinking how poetic it is that when they call Victoria Station on the train, they get to Victoria Station, not someplace else. That there's such a glory and this kind of order, right?
That's a really good example.
But she says, "Go in peace" to him, and something happens to him, right? He stops and sort of shudders, and she walks toward him thinking for sure, "Oh shoot, he's turning into my doppelganger now. He must be. This has all been a big trap." But she comes toward him anyway, and instead of seeing her doppelganger, she hears a voice call out, and it's a guy with a cloth doublet on, with breeches below and a heavy head of thick hair above, and the arms suddenly went up again, and a voice sounded. It said in a shout of torment, "Lord God, Lord God!" So he's calling out, "Lord God, Lord God!" She says, "Can I help you?" And he says, "Lord God, I cannot bear the fear of the fire." She said, "What fire?" And still with his back to her, he answered, "The fire they will burn me in today, unless I say what they choose. Lord God, take away the fear, if it be thy will. Lord God, be merciful to a sinner. Lord God, make me believe." And then she's there in this prison cell of her ancestor, right? Or she can at least see it. And he's saying, make me believe, make me believe. The choice was first in her. Omnipotence awaited her decision. She knew what she must do, but she felt as she stood that she could no more do it than he. She could never bear that fear, the knowledge of being burnt alive, of the flames, of the faces, of the prolongation of pain. She knew what she must do. She opened her mouth and could not speak. In front of her, alone in his foul Marian prison, unaware of the secret means the Lord he worshipped was working swiftly for his peace, believing and unbelieving, her ancestor stood centuries off in his spiritual desolation and preluding agony of sweat. He could not see beyond the years the child of his house who strove with herself behind and before him. The morning was coming. His heart was drained. Another spasm shook him. Even now he might recant. Pauline could not see the prison, but she saw him. She tried to choose and to speak. Behind her, her own voice said, "Give it to me, John Struther." She heard it in his cell and chains as the first dawn of the day of his martyrdom broke beyond the prison. It spoke and sprang in his drained heart and drove the riotous blood again through his veins. Give it to me, John Struther." He stretched out his arms again. He called, "Lord, Lord." It was a devotion and an adoration, accepted and thanked. Pauline heard it, trembling, for she knew what stood behind her and spoke. It said again, "Give." He fell on his knees, and in a great roar of triumph he called out, "I have seen the salvation of my God." Pauline sighed deeply with her joy. This, then, after so long, was their meeting and their reconciliation, their perfect reconciliation, for this other had done what she had desired, and yet not the other, but she, for it was she who had all her life carried a fear which was not her fear, but another's, until in the end it had become for her in turn not hers, but another's. Her heart was warm, as if the very fire her ancestor had feared was a comfort to her now. The voice behind her sang, repeating the voice in front, "I have seen the salvation of my God." What a moment!
This passage is so beautiful.
It's wonderful.
The twists and the turns and one after another, just all the glorious surprises.
Yeah. I want to parse out what's happening here if we can, but I'd also like to read the next part with the doppelganger.
Pauline turned. She thought afterwards she had had no choice then, but it was not so. It was a movement as swift, as instinctive as that with which one hand flies to balance the other, but it was deliberate. She whirled on the thing she had so long avoided, and the glorious creature looked past her at the shouting martyr beyond. She was giddy with the still violence of this last evening. She shut her eyes and swayed, but she was sustained by the air about her and did not fall. She opened her eyes again. There, as 1,000 times in her looking glass, there, the ruffled brown hair, the long nose, the firm compressed mouth, the tall body, the long arms, her dress, her gesture. It wore no supernatural splendor of aureole, but its rich nature burned and glowed before her, bright as if mortal flesh had indeed become what all lovers know it to be. Its color bewildered by its beauty. Its voice was Pauline's, as she had wished it to be for pronouncing the imagination of the grand art. But no verse, not Stanhope's, not Shakespeare's, not Dante's, could rival the original. And this was the original, and the verse was but the best translation of a certain manner of its life. The glory of poetry could not outshine the clear glory of the certain fact, and not any poetry could hold as many meanings as the fact. One element coordinated original and translation. That element was joy. Joy had filled her that afternoon, and it was in the power of such joy that she had been brought to this closest propinquity to herself. It had been her incapacity for joy, nothing else, that had till now turned the vision of herself aside. Her incapacity for joy had admitted fear, and fear had imposed separation. She knew now that all acts of love are the measure of capacity for joy, its measure and its preparation, whether the joy comes or delays. Her manifested joy whirled on her with her own habitual movement. She sprang back from that immortality, no fear but a moment's truce of wonder and bodily tremor. She looked in her own eyes and labored to speak. A shout was in her. She wished to assent to the choice her beatitude had made. The shout sank within her and rose without. She had assented, then, or that afternoon, or before this life began. She had offered her joy to her betrayed ancestor. She heard now, though she saw nothing but those brilliant and lucid eyes, the noise of his victorious going. The unseen crowd poured and roared past her. Her debt was paid, and only now she might know why and when she had incurred it. The sacrifice had been accepted. His voice was shouting in her ears, as Fox said he had shouted, "To him that hath shall be given." He had had. She had been given to him. She had lived without joy, that he might die in joy. So apparently the first dead man, the suicide, turns into or is somehow replaced by her martyred ancestor. And she thinks she's been caught in this trap and that now she'll have to face her doppelganger. But she doesn't. Instead, she has to face John Struther. And she realizes that this is her chance to return the debt that she's incurred because of Stanhope carrying her burden for her. So, all right, okay. She faces up to the moment. Here she is. Time has been abolished. She's standing there in the presence of this man who died 4 centuries ago. And he's said specifically what it is that he needs. The fear of the fire is what he cannot carry. And she can't do it. She cannot do it. I mean, who could, right? Who could bear that fear for someone else? Can I keep going? Because this is just
Yes.
like my favorite ever. But jump in, you or Sophie, if you want to. And so behind her, someone else says that they will carry the fear of the fire. Give it to me, John Struther. But it's her doppelganger. And it turns out that is her real self, not an evil twin, not a demon aping her shape, but that is her real, true, glorified self, or you might almost say unfallen self, that has the spiritual wherewithal to carry his burden for him. And then, as if that's not mind-blowing enough, I don't even know if I can say this bit without crying. She has been full of fear her entire life because that was her carrying of his burden. She gave up 20 some odd years of joy to her ancestor now on this day, and it was retroactive. So she's never had any joy all her life. But somehow, this is the part I want your help on, was she then split in two, and the doppelganger was her joy-filled, glorious self that could never have any fear and could never have its joy, and now they finally get to be reunited? Or is the doppelganger was able to carry the fear and not have its joy touched? So that part I am not sure about. But all I know is that it's just absolutely beautiful that she had lived without joy that he might die in joy. That's astonishing. Okay, the first time I read this, I didn't get it at all. I didn't get the doppelganger's role. I just thought that Pauline somehow managed to carry the fear. The second time I read it, I got the doppelganger's presence and that the doppelganger is the one who says, give it to me. And that was mind-blowing. I was like, oh, so the doppelganger carries the fear. That makes sense. But now this time I'm like, but if the Pauline of our narrative is the one who's giving it up on this day and it was retroactive, then who is the doppelganger and what purpose did she even serve? So I've just talked myself into more confusion than I knew I had.
Yeah.
I'm almost getting it, but not quite.
Yeah. I mean, it's how I feel also when I read Till We Have Faces, because there's a very similar thing going on there with Psyche and your Oriole as well.
It's almost like a time travel narrative, right? Where we have our person in the present makes a decision and then goes into the past, and then we get to follow the past person up until they see their future present self making the decision. So it's almost like we have to have the doppelganger to make the decision so that Pauline consents to it, because it wouldn't be a true substitution and exchange if it weren't a consent and a contract. But the fear-bearing Pauline is unable to make that contract because she's already burdened by the fear. So it's almost like the burdened Pauline is the result of the joy-filled Pauline's decision. Whew. That's difficult.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there.
Because I just thought it was like the glorious Pauline, but now I think it's who Pauline would have been had she not borne this fear all those 20 years and more. But having made the decision, it then created the fear-bearing self. Am I just making this worse than it needs to be? Sophie, help.
I don't know. I was just thinking through it because there's that passage on 170 when she's thinking through it right after she sighs with joy. She talks about how the other had done what she had desired, but it wasn't the other, it was she. So I don't know, it's some sort of union of them, and then in turn then Stanhope carries it. I don't know. I was looking at 172 right after you stopped reading this little line. I'm probably reading too much into this little line that talks about that now the act was for resurrection and death. So I don't know, I'm sort of playing along with this notion of perhaps the doppelganger is what she would be like in like her resurrected self beyond death. I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense, and that makes sense with all the romantic theology that's pulsing through this whole passage. There's that moment, the rich nature of the doppelganger. This is top of 171. Its rich nature burned and glowed before her, bright as if mortal flesh had indeed become what all lovers know it to be, right? And William says this really important idea that when you're first in love, when you first fall in love and you're in that initial glow of almost idolizing the other person, you see them as they really were meant to be. You see them as they would have been if they were unfallen, or as they will be when they're resurrected and glorified. So she's seeing the romantic theology version of herself. So is she seeing like into heaven, into a restored Edenic vision of herself? I'm sorry if I cut you off, Sophie. You gave me that idea.
No, I mean, that was mainly what I was thinking. Or even this notion of the doppelganger is her manifested joy. I don't know. I think it has something to do with all of those, but there's some way in which it is an other, but not an other, of some unity between them going on.
Yes, this is the moment when they're reunited, right? Her beatitude, her doppelganger, leant forward to her as if to embrace. The rich presence enveloped her. Out of a broken and contrite heart, she sighed with joy. On the inhaled breath, her splendor glowed again. On the exhaled, it passed. She stood alone at peace. Behold, I have made all things new. So that's they reunite there.
And even the line, behold, I make all things new, I mean, has everything to do with the final restoration and redemption of the whole world and the new creation. So it seems like he's giving us a glimpse of the final resurrection, which would make sense because time doesn't really exist here in Battle Hill.
So just like she's seeing her ancestor 400 years ago, she's also seeing her resurrection self X number of years in the future, or when time is abolished.
Maybe. I feel like that could be a possibility, right?
Oh, wow. And then the word beatitude, because she's already been a Beatrician moment for the man who died by suicide when he saw the figure of a girl, which is like Williams's self-allusion to his title, The Figure of Beatrice. So she's been a Beatrice, and then the doppelganger is her beatitude, like it's herself turned to be beatricified, right? Her Dantean glorified self. Oh, I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's super cool. And also it's called the Descent into Hell, right? And what did Christ descend to hell to do, right? To bring people up, right? There's a resurrection involved here. So I still don't know if I could give sort of a play-by-play of the mechanics of how exactly this all happened, but it's really cool, and it makes so much emotional sense. Partly, I think, because I've read the Inklings so much and am used to this idea of eucatastrophe, right? That this is such a beautiful moment of the very thing that she's been frightened to death of all her life becomes the means of another's salvation when she herself does not have the ability to save that other. It's an absolutely beautiful moment. The final thing that happens in this chapter is she talks more with Peter Stanhope, and he talks about this idea of Gomorrah, that the Lord's glory, he says, fell on the cities of the plain of Sodom and another. We know all about Sodom nowadays, but perhaps we know the other even better. Men can be in love with men and women with women and still be in love and make sounds and speeches, but don't you know how quiet the streets of Gomorrah are? Haven't you seen the pools that everlastingly reflect the faces of those who walk with their own phantasms, but the phantasms aren't reflected and can't be? The lovers of Gomorrah are quite contented, Periel. They don't have to put up with our difficulties. They aren't bothered by alteration, at least till the rain of fire of the glory at the end, for they lose the capacity for change except for the fear of hell. We're setting up this idea, or further developing this idea of fire as the glory of God, but also God's judgment, that they're one and the same, and the way that they hit you depends on the state you've chosen, right? And then also this idea of Gomorrah as being the opposite, not of Sodom, but of Zion. That Zion is the city, is the ultimate form of the true city, of which all other cities are kind of like copy. And Gomorrah is the city of complete self-love, right, where we turn our capacity to love completely inward rather than reaching out to the other. Any last thing that should be said about this chapter, or about this concept of Gomorrah, which ends up becoming quite important?
Application inward in the novel, of course, is to Wentworth. That Wentworth is our living example of Gomorrah. When Stanhope says, there's no distinction between lover and beloved, they beget themselves on their adoration of themselves. That's exactly what Wentworth has done, right? He's begotten this creature that's now his beloved. And so he's sort of feeding on himself by rejecting anybody else in favor of this own image of himself.
Yeah, and it's hard with that not to think of Satan in Paradise Lost, when he gives birth to sin while he's still in heaven, and he doesn't realize it, and then he kind of has a love affair with sin and produces death, which seems to be an exact analogy to what Wentworth is doing with this Lilith figure. So we haven't seen death yet, but I'm sure death will come around in some form or other for Wentworth. Yeah.
And then to continue that, then death gives birth to the sins, right, which then devour her from the inside out in Milton.
Yeah. So it's not just Charles Williams who is weird. Milton was pretty weird too. Quickly, I'll go through basically what happens in chapter 10, the sound of the trumpet. It's a shorter chapter. It's getting increasingly bright. Some people love it. Some people do not like it very much at all. And the people who don't like it seem to feel that it's quite hot. And that kind of gives us a clue as to the spiritual condition of those people based on Stanhope talking about the glory of the Lord falling on Gomorrah. Pauline's grandmother, by the way, has died. She tells Stanhope, and Stanhope acknowledges that yes, her grandmother died, and they keep on talking about whatever it was they were talking about. It's okay. Stanhope quotes some lines from The Tempest. Periel guesses that she was modeled after Ariel. Pauline guesses that either her character is modeled after Ariel, or she is, or something of the kind. We pick up with Lily Samil, who's talking to Stanhope, and Lily says, perfection would be so dull, wouldn't it? It's better to think of it than to have it, isn't it? I mean, who was it said it's better to be always walking than to get there, which is a great change of better to travel hopefully than to arrive, right? And Stanhope was just having none of that, and he says, no, thank you very much, he said, laughing outright. I'd rather have perfection than think of it, though I don't see why we shouldn't do both. And this upsets Lily Samuel a bit. Got a little bit about Adela, who also really doesn't like the heat. She is trying to convince Pauline, now that the play seems like it's going to be a big success, trying to convince Pauline to convince Stanhope to sort of take the show on the road so that Adela's star can rise, since she's kind of the star of the play. We get this odd exchange between her and Hugh. He tells her to shut up because the play's about to start. This annoys her. And then as the play starts, I forget if it says it starts or as it stops, but Lily Samil faints, and that's kind of the end of the sound of the trumpet. So I'm sure I did not do very much justice in my hurry to summarize. But what amendments would you all suggest to what I said, or other things that we need to make sure to bring up in the sound of the trumpet?
This is the chapter in which Pauline becomes a Jedi Master. Now that she's done her act of exchange, at the top of page 180, she realizes stillness and silence as a new entity or existence in themselves. She was aware of a new thing, of speech in relation to the silence in which it lived. And from here on out, she has a kind of contentment inside herself that's very unusual. And there's what one character in each of William's novels who has this sort of unshakable calm in the face of whatever happens. Although we do get a delightful little interchange, page 182, when her old self and her new self have a little colloquy. Adela says the most annoying thing: "I've always thought this a very remarkable play." Pauline's heavenly nature said to her other, without irritation, but with some relevance, "The hell you have." So it's like the sanctified self can still say that to the unsanctified self as a kind of pleasant joke at Adela's expense.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not sure how, but again, I'm not sure how a lot of things work in this kind of dynamic between the sanctified and unsanctified Pauline, or the resurrected and unresurrected Pauline, or whatever it is, right? Yeah, anything else worth noting in this short chapter in The Sound of the Trumpet?
The narrator tells us something pretty startling and nasty about Adela. Towards the bottom of page 182, the narrator tells us that Adela was not altogether unpracticed in the gymnastics of Gomorrah. Her spirit had come near to the suburbs. So that means she's in love with herself. So even though she and Hugh are dating now, it seems like she's starting to turn inward the way Wentworth was. We're told that she hates asking favors of Pauline. She disliked subordinating herself. So she's in some danger of sliding down that rope that descends into hell if she's not somehow brought back into community.
That makes absolute sense for someone who is used to being the star of the show, whether in life or in art. But yeah, it's the temptation is to think that you are as important as other people seem to be making you.
And it's starting to mess up her relationship with Hugh as well. On the bottom of 184, we're told that early in their relationship, there had been between them an amount of half-pretended mastery and compulsion. So they used to play at like, who's the boss in this relationship, right? Who wears the pants in this relationship? But then when Hugh tells her to shut up, she thinks that he's not playing anymore. And she has to decide whether to reject or allow that authoritative assumption. So whether she's going to submit and obey, or whether she's going to assert herself. I'm not sure which is the right decision there, because I'm not really a big fan of the like, yes, Hugh, whatever you say, Hugh, if he's bullying her and bossing her around. But in the economy of this novel, to submit and to obey and to humble oneself is generally the right decision.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to, like, right after that, how it says that she's Athanasian in spirit. She knew she was right and the world wrong, but then unathanasian in method, that she intended to manage the world. And so it feels like one of the first breaking downs of her and community, because instead of being a part of the community, she decides that she's superior to it and is going to just like manage it. And that's all going to work out just great, which obviously that never works out great. So
what
even
does
just
that mean,
though,
Athanasian and unathanasian?
I mean, it was like Athanasius knowing that he was right.
Athanasius contra mundi or something?
Yeah. And then, but his method wasn't to try to manage the world.
Oh, I see.
I guess. So I guess it's a good thing that she's Athanasian in spirit, potentially, and that if she thinks she's right, she sticks to it. I'm not sure, because when she thinks she's right, she seems to be wrong. Whereas it seems like Athanasius was probably right.
At least according to Williams.
Yeah.
And then there are these four options laid out, right? She would neither revolt, nor obey, nor compromise. she would deceive. And just a moment later, we're told that these are the 4 only possible alternatives for the human soul. So that's it. That's the only thing you can do in any given situation: revolt, obey, compromise, or deceive. Take your pick. And obviously, the novel wants us to choose to obey.
Yeah.
Then what happens immediately after that is that Adela is caught up in the play. And I think, if I'm reading it right, that in spite of her own residence in the suburbs of Gomorrah, that I think Adela does submit to the poetry, I think, and then becomes more than herself in the role of the princess, if I'm reading that right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it could be that the play is, a means of salvation for her as well, right? That she is, in taking on this role that Stanhope specifically has written, right? That she is able to act out something that changes her, just as Pauline does, or slightly different way, but in a similar, along similar lines. And that's part of. I mean, I think one question that I tend to have with this novel is sort of like, well, how does the present cause the past, right? How can you really, if she already knew that her ancestor John Struther had done this great feat of bravery and martyrdom, right? What does it really matter? Whether is it going to suddenly, like, are we going to get Back to the Future 2 if she does not, take his burden for him, and suddenly everything's changed? And I think it's more of a dance or a drama that she's taking part in, right? Something that has been decided beforehand and written out beforehand, and it remains for the individual people to do the actions that have been scripted out for them. There's a kind of gift that she gives to John Struther, and she does take his fear, but it's as a part of it's her part in the play, right? Rather than something rather than a situation that she's authoring herself, right? That it's a situation authored by another, and she is stepping into that role, and becoming more herself through that. So a couple of quick questions before we end. So I've been thinking about this a little bit with Peter Stanhope and us sort of talking about, like, okay, does Williams just have a really high opinion of himself, and is he just kind of, because clearly he wrote under Peter Stanhope, and I wonder if, rather than being a vain self-portrait of Williams, whether Peter Stanhope is kind of the good doppelganger of Charles Williams, kind of Charles Williams imagining himself as he would be if he were, resurrected or perfected or whatever else. Does that sound reasonable, or is that just me
I absolutely
hoping?
think that's what he's meant to be. I absolutely think he's trying to write what he wishes to be, what he would be if he were Peter Stanhope, Taliesin, if he were the leader of the company, the Bard. But the problem there is that, according to his own romantic theology, it's supposed to be someone else who writes us that way, not ourselves. It's supposed to be the lover who sees the beloved as glorious and glorified, not myself looking in the mirror and seeing my glorified self.
Yep, I think that's fair. Final goofy question. Peter Stanhope has written this play, and they are working on producing it. It is never given a title, and so what I asked you all to do is to either pick a title for Peter Stanhope's play or write a scene from the second pylon. I want to know which one you decided to do and what you think a good title would be.
I think I'm fresh out of surrealistic plastic cohesion.
That's fair enough. I don't have much myself.
We could just record a series of rhythmic industrial sounds.
Yeah.
For the second pylon.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know that the second pylon even has dialogue, right?
Right.
It probably has lots of mass, but probably not.
We've been doing a lot of home renovation here this week, and this afternoon my husband was doing something with a polishing machine. It could just record that and make this vroom, vroom, vroom soundtrack to the second pylon.
That sounds good. That sounds good. I was thinking for the Stanhope's play, because there's so much in it about the Tempest, and because he references the Tempest throughout, and he kind of plays the role of Prospero, because Prospero himself was probably played by Shakespeare, that a line from The Tempest would work really well as a title for the play, but I have no idea what line, and the best thing I could think of is "O Brave New World," which of course is already, taken, not for a play, but for a novel. So yeah, some possibilities. Admired Miranda, My Dukedom got, because there's a Grand Duke, right? Assault on Mercy, which comes from the epilogue at the end, which is so Williamsian, or rather Williams is channeling Prospero's epilogue a lot, where he talks about, please pray for me, basically, and I need you in order to get where I need to go. And then, of course, the fact that the play has a bear, and this is about bearing each other's burdens. Love bears, all things. Other ideas for
exit pursued by a bear?
Yeah, I love that. And that brings in the other. I think there's a lot of nodding towards A Winter's Tale as well.
I like the idea of taking something from the epilogue to The Tempest, because there is a movement in Charles Williams' novels, and this is his next to last novel. There is a movement away from the very specifically occult material that he learned in the ritual secret societies, and there's a distinct movement towards coherence and towards a much more Christian vocabulary, and we have fewer of these scenes of sorcery and black magic and a devil's Sabbath and things like that we have in the earlier novels, and the mage or magician figure is replaced by the Peter Stanhope figure. So I kind of think something from the epilogue where Prospero gives up on magic, right? My charms are all o'erthrown. Something like that would be a reference to what Williams is trying to do instead, I think. Prospero says, now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant. So he's given up on those things. So if this is maybe Stanhope's last play, something about now I want art to enchant. And want there does not mean desire, but lack. Now I lack the art to enchant. And yet this is a work of art that does enchant, as is The Tempest and as are Prospero's words. So it's a bit of dramatic irony there.
Do you have it pulled up? Would you like to read the epilogue?
Oh, I would love to. Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now, 'tis true, I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free.
It's so great. It's one of my favorite things that Shakespeare's written, and
it's so beautiful because he's speaking directly to the audience. Like, it's your good hands, your applause for my play that will set me free. How about relieved by prayer?
Mm-hmm.
That might not be a good title for Stanhope's play, but it might be a good title for this novel or for one of the chapters. Relieved by prayer.
Absolutely. And prayer as a kind of weapon.
Engine against the Almighty, to quote. Is that Herbert? I think that's Herbert.
Yes, I think so. I can't think of a better note to end on. Sophie Burkhardt, Sorina Higgins, Thank you so much for joining me as we covered close to the end of Descent into Hell. Listeners, thank you. Looking forward to finishing up this novel with you. Thank you all.
All blessed encounter full of joy, unscheduled on the decent plan, with here an addict of Tolkien, there a Charles Williams fan.